So a friend of mine asked me to do a how-to on homesteading, and I'm not going to do that, but this is what I'm going to do instead. So the title of this is "There are More Important Things Than Growing Your Own Food," and it's always fun to record something that I know is going to surprise people, and they're going to say, "What? I thought you'd say something different." Which is the whole point of having to produce things, right? Because if you could just predict what I was going to say, there'd be no need. I'm actually re-recording this. I almost never do that, but I flubbed up one of these graphs so badly that I felt bad, and I'll just redo this instead. So here we go. Why, why wouldn't I do a how-to on homesteading? Well, I might still at some point, right? But everything I do is prioritized for the impact that I think is going to have. And many of these things are ordered in time. It's a sequence, and you can't break the sequence. It doesn't make any sense. To illustrate this point, recently, so we have access to this weird homeschool program where you get reimbursed for homeschool expenses, which is great. It would have been a lot better 10 years ago when we had all this front loaded cost for curriculum and all these other crazy things that my wife would do a better job telling you about than me, because she's in charge of all that. But it's got the kids thinking like, what could I ask my parents for that the homeschool police people would sign off on? And he came to me and he said, I want to build a robot. And I said, or he wanted to buy a robot. And it was from one of these homeschool catalog things, and almost everything in those is just a ripoff for what you get. And I tried to explain to him that it wasn't going to be what he expected. I said, but I think it's a great idea. If you want to get into robotics, he's very young, but he does know how to code, which is shot. I mean, he's very young. But I said, well, instead of buying this fake overpriced thing, why don't we build something for real? So here's what I want you to do. I want you to keep an eye out for problems that a robot would solve and pitch them to me, and I'll help navigate you to one that is realistic and has a good impact, but also a good plausibility. Of course, I had to explain what impact and plausibility meant. So he comes back and he says, okay, I've got an idea. I said, all right, what? He said, I want to make one of those robotic vacuum cleaners. I said, okay, first off, that's serious. That's a serious project, right? But you can also just buy one. And I mean, if you want to spend the next 20 years of your life reinventing this thing, that's fine. And that's what it would take for one person. But that really doesn't seem like a good idea. And his next idea was, I want a speaker or a microphone speaker combination that I can talk into, and it will go to Spotify and play music. And I said, that's called a cell phone, dude. I was like, what problem can we solve that you haven't solved before that isn't like, I want to build a jumbo jet in my backyard implausibility? And so we had to talk about that. So that's a lot of time to give you a very specific real world example of an idea where we just vastly underappreciate everything. And I had to explain to him as best I could, look, anything that uses voice recognition is tapping into a very sophisticated program that's been built and trained, that's sitting on a bunch of servers somewhere, and someone spent way more than $1 million building that. Like, for example, the transcripts on upwardthought.org, it's using a program that's available through Amazon's web services that they have paid to train up. And it's not perfect, but it's not free either. It costs money every single time we run one of these videos through it. But it is way less expensive than me building that myself. That would be a full-time job for one person. It would take forever. Okay? It's very complicated. But that complexity is hidden from modern people who just see the world as a flat hierarchy of everything is simple, everything is easy, everything should be free, except whatever I do for work. That should be really expensive because I want to get paid a lot. You see? That mentality is so ingrained in everything we do. And so it's no surprise that tons of people are waking up to the idea of homesteading, and they're like, yeah, well, where's the light switch I flip? Or, okay, I bought some land, now what? If you're starting to ask, how do I do this after you bought land, you're probably already in deep trouble. Why? Because most land is terrible for homesteading. And it's one of these chicken egg problems, because you can't know how to do it until you do it. You can't do it until you've got land. Now, if you're real serious, the thing to do is to go apprentice someone who's already done it. And then you could pick up from where they left off. And that's how people did it in the olden days. I mean, you'd learn from your parents, but if your parents were poor, you'd go work on someone's farm who was successful, which means they figured it out, right? And then you could imitate that to the extent that you built up the resources to do so. But we just think if you have money, you have everything. You could buy anything in this world with money. It's not true. And what we're finding is this reversal in real time, where things that you used to be able to buy with money, you can't buy no matter how much money you have. Or it takes way more than it used to. And you call up a contractor to fix something for you, or put an extension on your house, or redo your roof or whatever. And you're like, my goodness, I thought I was making good money. This guy is going to make so much money off this job. And I'm stuck because I need it and I can't do it myself. Well, it's a lot like that. And so when you come to the table and you say, well, I've got money, I'm going to buy a property, you don't have the most valuable part. There are two parts you're missing: labor and know-how. Probably three parts. Equipment would be the third, because you have none of those things. Okay? So we're going to talk about that. The other problem with this is, and this feeds into the labor part of it and the know-how part. Know-how, you get know-how through doing the thing. When it comes to homesteading, you get know-how from doing the thing. You will be shocked in this world of I can Google anything. You'll be shocked by how little information there is online about the particulars of homesteading in a specific area. I know this from experience. I went around and I talked to all the old timers. The knowledge was not here. None of them knew how to do the stuff I wanted to do. Most of them said the things that I wanted to do were impossible, but none of them had tried it. And I know why they didn't try it. They didn't want to invest endless amounts of time and money into something that they could just go buy from the store. They didn't see the point in it. One neighbor explicitly told me this. He said I was a fool for doing what I was doing. So they have these things called extension centers, which is usually the state college. But you can call up these extension centers, and they're supposed to be a repository of knowledge for the specific geographical area. But they, like all the other academic institutions, have become corrupted. And they spend their time doing research for the seed companies for the most part. And so the seed companies pay them to find out the things that are relevant to what they want to know. And in some cases, probably just to spin up data that supports their company, just like the pharmaceutical industry does. But they can't answer the simplest of questions. I called the bee expert in Montana. I said, look, and she's in Bozeman. I said, look, I live in western Montana on a 5-acre plot. I want to know what flowers I can grow that I won't have to water that will feed bees. She said, I don't know. I have no idea. I said, aren't you the bee expert? Like, what's more fundamental than how to feed these things? And she said, well, all my research is more for large-scale farms. And I said, oh, all right. So I had to go out and buy like 200 different flower varieties and plant them all over several years to see which ones, because it's not just enough to plant them and then a one-season test. Some of these have super deep tap roots, and they're perennials and or bushes. And so you'd need several years to test them. You know, if you're 65, that's not an option available to you. Well, I shouldn't say that. If you really enjoy gardening and you want to be at it until you're 90, go for it. But if you lose your mind or your joints in the meantime, you're in big trouble. And also, if you're living in a place where you have to do physical labor and you have physical problems, or they develop, you're just going to have to sell and move, right? So we're just on the first slide here, but there's a massive amount of experimentation needed. It's lots of time, it's lots of money, it's lots of labor, it's a big old problem. And if you're coming at this with a small set of resources, as far as time, money, and labor, you're probably not going to be successful. And so here's what I want to introduce to you. It's a priority order for cost benefit. If you're watching this channel and you're aware of the kinds of things that I've talked about, your very first priority should not be drop everything, move to a homestead. Grow a little food. It has an enormous benefit, net benefit, relative to the cost. You can live in an apartment building and have a tomato plant on your balcony, right? I know a guy who lives in a suburb and he's got a super strict HOA, but he figured out you're allowed to have pots and plants. And so he got a bunch of huge pots and he has them basically filling the perimeter of his yard. And he's got all kinds of things growing in there, including a bunch of stuff that's never going to grow. And I really wish he had talked to me first because I could have saved him a lot of money, but whatever. That's the first thing. The next thing is move away from nuclear fallout. If you're really serious about this stuff, you have to look at the long term. Homesteads aren't a 1-year project. They're a 20-year or 50-year project. And yes, that means you're probably not going to be there, even if you're young, when it comes to full fruition. If you start planting nut trees, that's something for your kids, not you. So that's where the saying came from, you're nuts. Just kidding. Maybe it did. The next thing is going to be to move to a sparse area. Just as nothing that you do makes any sense if we get invaded by a foreign country or if the grid goes down, similarly, nothing you do on a homestead is going to make sense unless you live in a sparse area. Why? If push ever really comes to shove and you need what you're growing, it's not going to do you any good unless you live in a very sparse area. If you look at a population map, and we're going to, you have to imagine all the intense places flowing out into the surrounding countryside, because that's exactly what they would do if there were no food. And when they do, the question is, how long would it take them to get to you, and what would the dispersion be? How many people would get to you at what frequency of time? There are very, very few places in the U.S. that satisfy these criteria of moving away from nuclear fallout and moving to a sparse area. If you don't satisfy those, then your benefits of homesteading are limited to what you might do before you really need it. And take it from me, there are immense benefits from that. Immense, especially if you have young kids. But if you're trying to go to set up a place for yourself and others that doesn't satisfy those two things, the benefit will be limited to when you don't actually need it. It can't do what you want it to do. Now, you might set up in a slow collapse, which is what we're going through at the moment. If things get bad enough, there might be a time where, like a Great Depression kind of situation, where the ability to grow food on a paid-off lot of land, as long as your property taxes aren't insane, which they'd probably get a lot worse at that time and bankrupt you anyway and force you to move. But if you could ignore that for a minute, there might be some window where you could grow what you need to eat without marauders coming and stealing it all and killing you. But if it's a grid down situation or an invasion or anything like that, any kind of long-term terrible situation, doesn't do you any good. The next thing is store lots of grain. The next thing is raise meat. And the next thing is grow grain. But if you show this graphically, which will help tell the story better, here net benefit is on the y-axis and the cost is on the x-axis. Growing a little food has an enormous net benefit. Very low cost, very high net benefit. You could focus, if you have more than a bucket on a balcony, if you have like a little 5x5 or 10x10 garden, you could focus on the things that cost the most at the store. And so now, especially if you have kids, you get all the benefits of that, and involving them in that work is also a nice stress reliever. It's a nice, you get out of it what you put in, simple problems to solve. It'll make you feel like you're making progress. It's something to be proud about. It's cheaper than antidepressants and has fewer side effects. But if you grow expensive things, like depending on where you live, tomatoes, for example, they're going to taste way better, be way more nutritious, and you save yourself some money. And if you dabble in something like winter squash or kale, you might have things that you could preserve through the winter. Kale's not a great example of that. You can dehydrate it, but that's weird. I've done it, but that's weird. But winter squash is something that costs a lot of money but stores very well. And so if you dedicate a little plot to winter squash, you could have a lot of that. And you might even be in a position where you could sell a little bit of that to your friends and family, although that would have diminishing returns on the time and effort it takes to do so. All right, so the next two are move away from nuclear fallout and move to a sparse area. Now, the interesting thing about these is because they're a life or death situation, the benefit of them, the raw benefit, is pretty similar. But the cost is also really similar. So in both cases, it's extraordinarily expensive to move away from nuclear fallout and move to a sparse area, because the number of places in the United States that fulfill those two criteria are very few and very expensive. The next thing is store lots of grain. This has a high cost. You need to buy the grain and you need to have the space to store it, which is a cool, dry place that's free from rodents. And it takes a lot of space because, if you get a 1-ton grain bag, that's about 4 feet by 4 feet by 4 feet, about. So you can imagine how much space you would need to do that. But it's a fantastic investment. The stuff lasts for 30 years, and you can plant it, eat it, feed it to animals, whatever you want to do with it. Throw it at your neighbor, whatever. So it has lots of uses. It'll hold down your house in the event of a hurricane. I don't think your concrete pad would go anywhere, but anyway. The next thing is raising meat. The number one problem with raising meat is you need land. You obviously need land for them to roam, but you also need food for them to eat. And if you're just buying feed, that's really never going to be economical. You'll have better quality meat, but it's still going to cost a lot. And that's just the cost of feed, not counting the cost of your time, any of the many things you'll have to buy, like food trays and water trays and things to keep it from freezing in the winter. And it's not even touching on your time and your labor or any outbuildings. I'm not sure if I mentioned that. Those can all get very expensive, right? If you live in a place where it rains, that cost goes way down. But the problem is that if you're living in a place that's less likely to experience nuclear fallout and has a sparse population, then that isn't an option for the most part. You might find an exception, but by and large, you're going to be dry farming. And when you dry farm, you have long winters and there isn't enough water to have lush grass for very long in the summer. And so you have to do something like hay, you need a lot more land, etc. And then there's growing grain, which I'll get into the downsides of that, but that's basically the last thing you want to do. So let's talk about moving away from nuclear fallout very briefly. Here are nuclear reactors, and here are potential targets for nuclear warheads. And what you can see is, and that the clouds follow wind patterns, this takes out most of the United States geographically, and much more than most of the United States as far as population density goes. So basically anything east of the Mississippi is out There are some exceptions, but for the most part, that's the way it is. Okay. What about population density? Here's the map. You can see that, again, the East Coast is densely populated. There are some exceptions. Mississippi has some spots, Alabama, but especially in Alabama, the flow of people out from those cities, it's going to render the sparsely populated places into all of a sudden much more populated. Okay? For the most part, this drives you west. There are exceptions towards the Great Lakes. Okay? But for the most part, you're dealing in the west. So if you overlay these two maps, what you're going to get, it's probably easier to see here, is western Montana, the Idaho Panhandle, although there's a power plant in Washington State, and also Spokane is a potential nuke target. But the northern part of Idaho and western Montana and the desolate wasteland of central Idaho, and that's kind of it, right? There's this slice of South Dakota maybe, and you've got towards the Great Lakes. So not much to choose from. The deserts of Nevada, perhaps, okay? I already talked about the benefits of storing lots of grain. But the chief thing to take away from this is you'd have to be in a place where it makes sense. Because if you're in a densely populated area, you can guarantee that if you ever needed that, people would come and steal it from you and probably kill you or worse in the process. The other thing to understand about this is just how drastically cheap it is to buy grain right now, relative to farming it yourself, and relative to what it will cost in the years to come. Remember, this can last over 20 years. And so, how much is it going to cost 20 years from now? I'm not sure modern people can imagine that. But I'll tell you, everything over time reverts back to subsistence farming. And if you have to do this by hand, you realize very quickly how cheap it is. When you can go buy a 50-pound bag of wheat berries for, say, $1 a pound, which you can get it much cheaper than that if you buy it in bulk from a farmer. But let's just call it $1 a pound, which would be on the expensive side, versus spending an entire week of your life to harvest and clean that grain. Same amount. That is an insane savings. That's how cheap it is. If you buy it in bulk, you can buy 1 ton of wheat this year in Sandpoint, Idaho for, I want to say $300 for a ton, 2,000 pounds. It is insane how cheap that is, okay? And so if you live in a place where you can buy and store that, that is a much better idea than messing around with homesteading. As a higher priority, is get a place in the middle of nowhere, get some kind of like Quonset hut or whatever, and put grain bags in there. Get 1 ton bags of grain and fill it up and be Joseph of Egypt, right? And then you worry about other things, and at least you have animal feed for the next 20 years. But you could rotate that, right? And so that would be a good insurance policy. But you could also plant it if you needed to, which wheat is not a good thing to plant, by the way, in those sorts of places. Rye is 1,000,000 times better. And I could tell you all about that if you'd like to know. So going down the list here, what about raising meat? Feed is the problem. So what most people do in the West is you got these hay ranchers, and they have land, and they have all the equipment to cut hay. And they'll eat, whether it's dry hay or irrigated hay, a lot of them have these giant irrigating wheels. And the hay market goes up and down in price just depending on the season and the particulars of the season. And they'll just buy mountains of hay to feed their cattle for about half of the year. And if they don't have giant fields, maybe they feed their cattle from hay bales all of the year. And that doesn't have to be a feedlot, by the way. I mean, you could have, say, 5 cows on 5 acres, and that's pretty compressed as far as dry land goes. But if you're feeding them from hay, it's a fine life for the cow. It's not going to be standing on giant piles of poop or anything. And that's a great way to build up soil, by the way. But you need to buy all that hay, and you're subject to the fluctuations of the market. You need a very expensive tractor to be able to lift 1-ton bales, which is what they are, ish. They're over 1,000 pounds, and that's the difference between, say, a $40,000 tractor and a $65,000 tractor. Imagine buying a $65,000 tractor for a small lot, which is, 5 acres, 10 acres, small lot. That's insane. That's so much money just to use it a little bit for moving hay. You can put a lot of chickens on 5 acres. You can have just backyard chickens with a backyard. You don't need even 1 acre to have chickens at all. But if you want a whole flock, you need more land. And depending on where you are, you need to put them in year-round outbuildings because of predators, just depending on where you are. There are places you can get away with free-ranging them, but the trouble and the expense and everything else, it's considerable, no matter how you slice it, unless you're in a place that isn't safe from nuclear fallout. All the nice places to raise chickens are in that zone. What about cattle? You need 1 acre per cow if the place gets rain regularly. So that's east of the Mississippi. West of the Mississippi, you need 10 acres per cow. And that's on dry land. I know that there are exceptions, but roughly speaking, the Mississippi is the dividing line. What about if you need to make your own hay? Well, then you're talking more like 100 acres to have some cattle. That's a lot. And you need tractors, and you need a baler, and you need a place to store the hay, right? So you need a tractor, you need a baler, you need a cutter, and a rake. These are all implements, and it all costs money. You know what? There are 0 people getting into this today. Why? Because you can't make money if you have to buy the land and the equipment today. These people are making very little per acre. It's just a residual thing. It's the old timers. Once they die off and their equipment breaks, that's that. All right? There are tremendous other limitations for raising meat. A lot of people want to raise meat and sell it. There are all kinds of laws and regulations. It's insane. Hopefully some of those will change with this election outcome and just the groundswelling of political involvement around food, homegrown food. But as of right now, it takes a lot to do. And the only way, besides that, it's so labor intensive that the only way to make money on this is to charge a lot more than what people are willing to pay. There is a market for high-priced meat when you say it's free range, grown outside, grass-fed, whatever. But there are only so many people that have the money for that, and that number is going to come down over time. And so this is much more a question of, I mean, you might find a market niche to do that, but this is much more about just growing it for yourself. And again, if you don't have a kid that you can just say, go get a chicken and butcher it, and they come back with a butchered and plucked chicken, you probably don't want to do that. You're going to look at that and you're going to say, I'd rather just buy one from Costco, right? Until you can't anymore, at which time you probably have bigger problems. All right. Now, what about grain? Long story short is to go from all these other things have a bunch of steps in between not doing it at all and doing it at commercial scale. I don't mean commercial like you're going to be the next Purdue chicken. I mean commercial like you're making measurable income off of this. like several thousand a year or more. There are many steps. With growing grain, there really aren't. There's one step, and it's called a combine. So combine is a special machine that looks like a super tractor, and it's got basically, it's a one-stop shop to drive it across the field of standing grain, and out comes the part you want to eat. So grain has a seed head, and the seed is going to be coated in chaff. And so you have to cut it down, take the seed head out, and get the chaff off the seed before it's edible. And that is quite a process to do by hand. Like I said, you could say it's about a week of full-time work to get 50 pounds out-ish for one person. Just doing it by hand. With a combine, you can just drive across the field and out comes the grain. So the problem is that combines cost a lot of money. It didn't used to be this way. Until the 1970s, you could buy an attachment for a normal-sized tractor, not like a huge tractor, not a lawnmower, but in between a lawnmower and a full-size farm tractor. You could buy an attachment for that for not too much money, and kind of the same price as a snowblower, and you just drive that thing across your field, and out comes the grain. But they stopped selling those because about that time, the farms began growing together and getting larger and larger. And they started building bigger and bigger machines. And this is where the monocropping huge farms came into being. And so now the cheapest combine you can get is like $25,000, and basically the wheels are falling off. It's got so many hours on it. It's a roll of the dice whether the thing will even start, and it's very likely that it'll break mid-harvest. And that's the gamble. So professional farmers, they make this gamble and they decide when they're going to replace equipment, and it's all based on the probability of it breaking down. But to justify $25,000 plus the breakdowns, you need a lot of land. I would say over 100 acres minimum. It'd be really nice to have 1,000. Now you're in the big leagues, but who's talking about that? So you want to grow 1,000 acres of rye every year? I'm there with you, but that's quite a bit of capital to get into that. And then you have to have, it's a huge problem to solve of what to do with what you produce. And this is the issue with economies of scale, is that you scale up to make the equipment and the land and everything make sense. But then once you're big, you have all these problems that you don't have when you're small. And finding, like if you have let's say you have a pair of cows and you want them to reproduce as often as they can. So that's a 2-year cycle. And you're selling those 2 calves when they get to butcher weight. Well, you can find a friend or two, and now basically you're getting free beef. It's just your labor. Once you're in on that, it's basically just your labor. And you're making a little bit of money each year on that, I guess every 2 years. So basically you're getting free beef and a little money on top in exchange for your labor. Well, scale that to 100 cows, and now you've got all kinds of nightmares with marketing, and you're probably having to wholesale, which means you're getting almost nothing for the meat, and, right? Anyway, going back to grain, what do you do? So let's say you get 1 ton of, let's say, rye out of each acre. Okay, what do you do with 100 tons of rye every year? Well, you can store it. And it just so happens you can feed it to pigs if you have the right kind of pigs, because that's not the greatest idea with all varieties. And so hopefully you start to get a sense for the complexities of all of this and what you need to know and what you don't know. But you're going to need grain silos to store the grain in. Those cost money. There are pros and cons to different ways of doing that. There are different kinds of silos. You're going to need an auger for the grain. You're going to need a big old tractor to lift those bags. You're going to need a place to store those bags. You're going to need people to sell your excess rye to. So all those things are complications. And so you can see that the net benefit goes down. So just to give you some parting thoughts, as time goes on, you're going to realize in all things, not just homesteading, but in all of life, you're going to start to realize the value of what you've taken lightly. And the way that's going to happen is that more of the weight is going to be put onto your shoulders. When you have to grow more of your food, you start to learn how much you've taken for granted. Farms are not a pack of pre-packaged Costco chicken breasts. That's not the way it works. It takes an enormous amount of time and effort to get there, and knowledge, and land, and equipment. In all things, there's no shortcut to what you seek. The price is the price. You can't get around it. And many things, including the kinds of homesteads people have in mind when they start daydreaming about this, it's going to cost you much more than you have the ability to comprehend. That is the resounding, recurring message for the future. You take the value of things and the cost of things for granted, and you're going to learn what it costs. And you can't jump from the beginning to the end. The path is long and hard. In all things, including homesteading, the next step that you're trying to avoid, which is why you don't have it already, it's essential. You can't skip it. So the biggest next step in your life is to get and stay right with God. That's obviously a recurring theme in these messages. And the next most important step is sort out your family. So people who want to go down the homestead route, you really need a group of people to do this with. Now, if you don't have kids, or your kids are grown and they think you're nuts or whatever, you still need to find other people. You can't do this as one person. And so that's your family in this case, okay? But you have to get yourself right and then extend to your family. There's a reason that the only people who do this are highly religious, who do this successfully, whether it's a big old family or whether it's a community. They're super Catholic, super Amish, whatever the super is. They're super something. Why is that? Because, one, true religion, whatever share of it those people have, whoever we're talking about, true religion teaches you a different set of value than what the world teaches you. Because worldly people are not going to want to do this. They would just rather go to Costco. And maybe they'll have a vacation home, but this is like, it's nice to go to the beach because you have a cooler full of things that don't grow on the beach, and ice, which also doesn't grow on the beach. I don't know if you get that, but that's the idea. It's like, do you want to LARP, live action role play? Do you want to pretend you're a farmer, or do you want to actually farm? Because if you want to pretend that you're farming, that's easy. But if you want to really farm, I'll tell you how extensive this is. Right next door to me, there's a very expensive ranch. Actually, I'm sandwiched by these things in the valleys adjacent to our valley. Not that I own the valley. In the one case, the ranch is operated by real farmers that the ranch owner, in both cases, they're real farmers who farm the land, but it's owned by someone else. And in both cases, people pay a lot of money to come to stay at these places and pretend like they're on the farm with the farm experience. But obviously they're not farmers, they're just tourists. And so even in that case, there's a person who brought the money, but they have to hire full-time farmers to run the land, because that's how different it is. So, and they live there and they know their stuff. So as far as it goes with homesteading, really think about what you want and get the plausible path to what you want. Because I wrote about this in the book Through Faith, not with homesteading, but the general principle, the pattern. You can't skip steps. if you want to grow your own food, all the food that you eat, or even a measurable percentage of it, a high percentage of it, and you're by yourself and older, it ain't going to happen. The prior required step is you need to find more people and or younger people to go in this with you. And without that, it's not going to go very far. But it's not enough to just get people, because most people are out of their minds. And when you start to work with them on a mutual project, you find this out very fast. It's very hard to work with people. So you have to purge that natural man and find people who, well, first you do it, and you find people who have also done it, and you're like-minded enough to work to a common goal. So I hope this helps you, not with what you wanted, but what you should have wanted, because what you're asking is to skip over this stuff, and it's very important.